Okay, so tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in the disability community.
Yeah, good question. So let's see. I just kind of starting with my background. I went to college originally as a human services major, and then switched to being a psychology major. And my original intention actually was to work for the Drug Enforcement Agency. Um, I was always very fascinated, I think, just by law enforcement and particularly kind of that area of the law. But somewhere within like my junior to senior year, kind of realized that that wasn't the path that I was gonna continue down. And when I graduated, I did finish with my undergrad in psychology, and I had applied for positions, and one of them was to be a case manager to work with adolescents with developmental disabilities. Um, and for me, it was really, an opportunity to use some of the experience that I gained through internships and just my undergrad coursework in general, to figure out kind of what would be my step a couple years later for grad school. And it was really just within that first job though that I really kind of realized that was an area that I just really enjoyed. I think that the big difference for me was, particularly with that role, it was helping adolescents to get state funded services. So things like physical therapy, occupational therapy, and just seeing the difference that it made for people, the difference of getting 12 weeks of service versus 16 weeks. And something that, for most people can seem so small was such a big difference for someone else, really just opened my eyes to being specifically in that kind of helping profession. Um, and since then, I've kind of grown in different areas in this work, and now have kind of a dual focus on both disability in terms of applying ADA, but also leave of absence.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So tell me a little bit about your work in HR and disability management. What's that about? Like, what do you do in those areas?
A lot of it is just looking at different ways that we're able to help employees, whether that's with accommodations to stay at work, or that's with, employees who may need to take time away from the workplace, and having a leave. So sometimes it really is kind of that hands-on work, engaging with employees directly to figure out how to support them. Other times, though, it's really being more involved in sort of the policy management, looking at, what are best practices to implement and resources that will help support our employees.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So, like, how do you make sure that people with disabilities, have equal access to employment? What sorts of tools and strategies do you use at your disposal to make that happen?
That's a good question. I think a lot of it is starting with the person themselves to figure out what's the barrier that they have to the workplace. So is that something that it's those initial steps to even getting through to an application? Is it something when they're at work that they need? Really look at this work from the lens of that each person is just, an individual and has a unique experience. And so really understanding what it is that people need specific for themselves, to help them have that equal access at work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, like, any particular stakeholders that you partner with in the realm of like HR and disability management?
Yeah, I would say a variety of different stakeholders. Benefit partners really tend to be a unique group to be able to work with, specifically with figuring out are there resources that maybe go outside of accommodations. For example, like EAP programs, I think are a really big resource for employees dealing with mental health conditions. Um, Business partners, those who are really more dealing with, the actual business line, talking with managers and supervisors very often. So I think, in this work, it's always varies depending on who you're engaging with, depending on the situation that you're working through.
Mm-hmm. Finally, if I could just ask, how can really how can HR really reduce the barriers that people with disabilities so often face, with employment, you know, and to like create an inclusive atmosphere for people with disabilities. So, like, in other words, how can HR really reduce the employment barriers that people with disabilities face? What sorts of things can that particular sector do to really include them in the workforce?
I think a lot of it is just starting from, kind of the ground level in the sense of, making sure that, policies don't sort of inadvertently keep somebody from employment, or, whether it's accessing an application. I think a good example a lot of times that, as all these new programs come out, to do the application process, it's really making sure, are these accessible with a screen reader? Is it clear that if an employee needs an accommodation, that there's a way for them to ask for that? So I think being transparent in ways that people can access those resources is a good one. I think too is just a big proponent, or I'm a big proponent, I should say, of ergonomics in the workplace. One of the things I always find interesting in that scope is, if somebody's having an issue related to their chair or their keyboard or whatever it may be, a lot of times it's going through the interactive process, it's going through and getting documentation, but it's something that all of us use at work. So, if those sort of things were just set up from the beginning of, here's our different resources of chairs, or we have an ergonomist who comes in and we'll do an evaluation. Something just as basic as that, I think, can really go a long way to creating a supportive and inclusive environment.
Yeah, I agree.